Why has this taken 37 years in a case that had so many questions? We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for a bloody jailhouse lawyer and a justice campaigner. And what does that say? It just says that it's a system that doesn't like to contemplate that it's made a mistake, and it's left to other people, not the authorities, not the police, not the Crown, to push for the right questions to be asked and for another day in court for these people, leading to wrongful convictions being exposed.
Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today, the David Tamihere case. Nearly 37 years ago, Swedish backpackers Heidi Parkinen and Urban Höglund were reported missing on the Coromandel Peninsula. In December 1990, so about 18 months later, David Tamihere was convicted of their murders and sentenced to life in prison. Then this week, those convictions were quashed. So to explain how it's all come to this, the Post and Sunday Star Times senior writer Mike White is with me. Mike, what did you think of the Supreme Court decision this week?
Well, I mean, it was a remarkable decision. It's not too often that you get one of the most controversial cases in New Zealand's history turned on its head. It was remarkable for a couple of reasons, really. One is that, as you say, Sharon, we're 37 years on from when Heidi and Urban disappeared. And all of a sudden, we're back to square one, really, because the Supreme Court has said, well, David Tamihere's case should go back to the courts. He should have another trial. And it was remarkable also because it was a very strong judgment from the Supreme Court, basically saying that the Court of Appeal, our second most powerful and our second most senior court in New Zealand, got it really wrong. And this was a unanimous decision from all five of the Supreme Court judges. I think it's a very good decision in the interest of justice because so much has changed over those 37 years. So much of the evidence has been knocked out or has been refigured. But also, it brings it up for the families of the victims, though. 37 years on, they're going to have to relive all this again. It's going to bring it right to the surface. So mixed emotions.
And we'll come back to the details of this decision a bit later on. But let's go back now to 1989. Tell me about Heidi and Urban.
Okay, so Heidi and Urban, they're engaged. They're a Swedish couple. They've been travelling around the world. They arrive in New Zealand. Urban is 23, Heidi's 21. They spend a couple of months in New Zealand, and the stop in the Coromandel where they disappeared was one of the last points on their journey. They were due to fly to Rarotonga shortly afterwards, but they never got to Auckland. So on Friday, April the 7th, 1989, they're last seen in Thames on the Coromandel. They get their hair cut, they go into a shop, and at both these places they say that they're thinking of going one of two places, up what's called Tararoo Creek Road, up a track that would lead to a place called Crosby's Crossing, or they might drive north around the top of the peninsula. Now, their car is found a couple of days later at the end of Tararoo Creek Road, at the bottom of the track that leads to Crosby's Crossing. So it's seen there by a number of people. But Heidi and Urban are never seen again. And so when they are reported missing, a search is launched. Eventually, the police investigation leads to David Tamihere. David Tamihere's been living in the Coromandel. He's been on the run from police, and he's been living off the bush, really, off the land for the last 3 years almost. David Tamihere says, hey, yeah, I stole their car, I stole some of their possessions, but I never met them. I just found the car in the car park, and I certainly didn't kill them. But the police case eventually brought Tamihere to trial, and as you say, he was convicted in December 1990 of the murders of Urban and Heidi. At that stage, though, no bodies had been found. So it was quite a remarkable conviction in those days in New Zealand to have a murder conviction with no bodies.
But, I mean, he had been in prison less than a year when, I suppose you'd call it the first hole in the case came up. In October 1991, pig hunters discovered Urban's skeleton near Whangamata. Now, why was that so crucial?
Okay, this was a major, major event. As you say, Tamihere's already in jail, and the pig hunters find Urban's body. It's not properly buried, it's just covered in vegetation, but it's found on the east coast of the Coromandel in somewhere called the Wentworth Valley near Whangamata. But that's 70 kilometres away from where the police said Urban was killed by David Tamihere at David Tamihere's trial. They said that Urban and Heidi were murdered at Crosby's clearing on the west coast of the Coromandel. So here we have Urban's body somehow 70 kilometres away. But even more interesting was that at David Tamihere's trial, witnesses and the police said that David Tamihere had taken Urban Hoglin's watch off him and had given it to his son when he got back to Auckland. But when the body was discovered, Urban's watch was still on his remains. So it shot a hole through the Crown case and the police case. However, it didn't stop the Court of Appeal, David Tamihere's 1992 appeal, confirming his conviction, saying, hey, well, the Crown and the police never really tied themselves to an exact location about where the murders happened. And so Tamihere's appeal failed, and his case languished, really, for more than 20 years after that.
Is that right? Because he did file a number of appeals, didn't he?
He applied to the Privy Council for leave to appeal there. That's something that you can't do in New Zealand anymore because we now have the Supreme Court. He applied for leave but wasn't granted it, so he never got his day in court in front of the Privy Council, as David Bain did, as Mark Lundy did. So really his case sat there for more than 20 years, and David Tamihere sat in jail for 20 years until he was released on parole in 2010.
But something else that popped up, another surprise, I suppose. In May 2017, a bushman found a plastic bag with 3 pairs of women's leggings. He found it in the bush on the Whangamata Peninsula and took it to police, to the local police station. But what happened with that?
I'll be completely honest with you here, Sharon. I know I haven't delved into this much. But what I can say is that, as far as I understand, those leggings were destroyed and a proper investigation wasn't done. So we're none the wiser as to whether they are connected with the case or not. They may well have had nothing to do with the case, but it sort of reflects a number of accusations about the police investigation, that there have been things that weren't done or things that were done that were very questionable. And some of those have come out in the most recent decision from the Supreme Court.
But Mike, there was something else that happened in 2017 that was much more significant.
Yes, indeed. This was when 2 people, Arthur Taylor, a lot of people will know Arthur Taylor, the jailhouse lawyer, a career criminal, but who's fashioned himself as a lawyer while he's been inside. Arthur Taylor and a justice campaigner, Mike Callagher, decided to test what the Crown had used during David Tamihere's trial, which was 3 secret witnesses, jailhouse snitches, and they all went to the police at the time of David Tamihere's trial. Now, one of them was a man called Roberto Conchi Harris. He was a notorious jailhouse snitch, and he had testified at David Tamihere's trial in 1990 that Tamihere confessed to him, and his evidence was crucial because it backed up some other very important eyewitness identification evidence from 2 trampers about seeing David Tamihere at Crosby's clearing and a woman that looked like Heidi. So Mike Callagher and Arthur Taylor decided to bring a private prosecution of Conchi Harris, saying that he lied at David Tamihere's trial. And they were successful. And so the jury decided that Conchi Harris's evidence at Tamihere's trial was perjury, and Harris was sentenced to 8 years in jail. Now, this removed one of the fundamental foundations of the case against David Tamihere, and it led to Tamihere in 2020 being allowed under the royal prerogative of mercy to have another appeal. Now, the royal prerogative of mercy is something that's hardly ever used anymore now, but it allows you to say, hey, I think I've been wrongfully convicted, and the Ministry of Justice and the Minister of Justice and eventually the Governor-General consider this and decide, yes, you've got a case, it's in the interests of justice that it be sent back to the Court of Appeal to reconsider your case.
And what was the outcome of that review by the Court of Appeal? Was that the decision of 2024?
Yes, it was. So in 2023, things don't move fast here.
No.
The justice system is really slow. Because, the Crown, there were hold-ups because the Crown suddenly faced with another appeal for David Tamihere. Said, we want to do some more testing, and pulled out their evidence and did forensic testing. And this all took a long time. Nothing came of that. But in 2023, the appeal was heard by 3 judges in Wellington at the Court of Appeal. At that hearing, the Crown produced a new scenario as to how David Tamihere had killed Urban and Heidi. Now, this was necessary, really, to cover off the fact that Urban's body had been found nowhere near where they originally said it would have been found, and what had been found on the remains. So the Crown presented a new theory with evidence, with eyewitnesses that placed David Tamihere on the East Coast where Urban's body was found. And the Court of Appeal, in their decision in 2024, said, okay, we accept that the evidence of Conchie Harris, the jailhouse snitch, that was wrong. He lied, and that was a miscarriage of justice. But they went further and said, look, under what we call the proviso, we think there's enough evidence still against David Tamihere that makes us convinced beyond reasonable doubt that he is guilty. And so they confirmed and upheld the convictions of David Tamihere in 2024. David Tamihere's lawyers immediately went to the Supreme Court, asked for leave to appeal there, got leave, and last year that appeal was heard in the Supreme Court, leading to the decision this week that was released, which has quashed his convictions.
There was another bombshell, though, in 2023. And did you break this story about Sir Bob Jones, the well-known property developer? The late Sir Bob Jones, we should say. Tell me about that. How did that happen?
Okay, so Bob Jones knew the lead investigator of the Tamihere investigation. It was called Operation Stockholm because these 2 Swedes had disappeared. So the head of that was Detective Inspector John Hughes. Now, he was a legend in the police, a kind of a take no prisoners kind of guy. He was a very strong and forceful police officer and a very successful one, but he was also drew some criticism and there was controversy. He was involved in the Arthur Allen Thomas investigation. Of course, Thomas had his conviction overturned in the Crewe murders. John Hughes was known to Bob Jones through boxing. John Hughes had been a boxer in his earlier days. And so shortly after David Tamihere was convicted, Bob Jones says that they were at an evening dance, a function. John Hughes came up to him. Allegedly, John Hughes had had a bit to drink. And Bob Jones said that John Hughes started poking him in the chest and said, I got Tamihere. We stitched him up, but he was guilty. And so I heard about this and approached Bob Jones, thinking that Bob Jones wouldn't necessarily confirm it. But he was absolutely adamant that this is what had happened. And later he signed an affidavit for David Tamihere's lawyers explaining exactly what had happened and that theoretically, allegedly, John Hughes had confessed to fitting up David Tamihere.
So Sir Bob Jones knew about this very early on, is that what you're saying? But he didn't actually go public with it with you until 2023.
Bob Jones wasn't hiding the fact because I was first alerted to it. Someone sent me an email that Bob Jones had written quite a long time ago, which mentioned it. And that caused me to contact Bob. And he told me exactly what happened over the phone. Then I went and interviewed him in person in his office in Wellington, and he was absolutely adamant that this is what had happened. It wasn't like he was trying to hide it at all, and hence why he made the affidavit for David Tamihere's lawyers.
Can we talk about the role of the media in this case? Because investigative journalists like you have played such a big part in the developments.
Yeah, look, inevitably in a case like this where there's so much public interest and many unanswered questions, journalists are attracted to that, and we have an important role in looking at it. I think it's fair to say that this case, like some others, attracts more media attention. And being completely cynical, well, maybe it's because it was two young, very attractive Swedish tourists. But it also, part of the reason was that this, at the time, reflected terribly on New Zealand. Here were two innocent travellers who'd come to New Zealand to enjoy what it offers, and had disappeared and been murdered. And so all of a sudden, New Zealand's reputation was sullied somewhat. But I think it goes far beyond that. I think it's more that the police case against David Tamihere had a lot of questions about it from the start, and many more arose after Urban Haugland's body was found, and they've continued. And so everyone is trying to get to the bottom of it. It's a whodunit in its most basic form, like a lot of these cases. Have we got the right person, and has justice been served? And I think, therefore, it's natural that journalists have continued to look at this, and there have been some remarkably fine pieces of journalism written about the David Tamihere case, including one by Donna Chisholm, the legendary journalist, in North and South magazine.
Some journalists believe that others were implicated besides Tamihere. Did you have your own theories on this case and the outcome?
No, look, there's always suggestions of who else it might be. I think David Tamihere's case is made more difficult because he's not an obvious alternative killer. It's not like David Bain's case where it's David or Robin Bain. It's not like Taina Pora's case where it's obviously Malcolm Rewa. It's more of the Scott Watson kind of case or the Mark Lundy case. Well, if it wasn't him, who was it? And I think it's always more difficult in those kind of scenarios. But I've never really had a view on who an alternative killer is. I've just been interested in the evidence against David Tamihere, whether it stacks up and whether it's still sustainable.
That brings me to the decision this week. I mean, you've said it's a remarkable decision by the Supreme Court. Is it the right decision?
Look, I'm certainly not a lawyer. I flunked out at law school, so I'm the absolutely wrong person to give advice on whether it's right or not. But from a layman's perspective, and from someone who has followed this case, and I did attend the Court of Appeal hearing and the Supreme Court hearing, I think it's absolutely the right decision. The Court of Appeal, the logic that they used and the approach they took was difficult to sustain under strong questioning. I don't think enough questions possibly were asked at the Court of Appeal hearing, but at the Supreme Court hearing, the judges there, they're the finest in the land, and they asked very strong questions. They tested the Crown case, and they've come to a unanimous decision, and I don't think there's any argument with their decision. But by the same token, they've also said that, hey, we're not saying that David Tamihere is innocent. We're just saying that his trial was fundamentally unfair, and that the new case that's being brought by the Crown, the new scenario, which puts the Swedes on the east coast of the Coromandel, that hasn't been tested in front of a jury. And that's a fundamental right that David Tamihere has, to have that put in front of a jury and to be able to cross-examine witnesses, etc., and test that Crown case. So they're saying that David Tamihere might still be found guilty, but to do that, you need a new trial.
And there seems to be a lot of questions, a lot of debate around that. You've talked to David Tamihere a number of times. Can you tell me a bit about him?
Oh, look, David's a very quiet kind of person now. It's interesting. You talk to people who met David at the time, and they say that he was a very talkative, fun guy. David's been a model parolee since he was released from prison in 2010. He's stayed close to home in Auckland, his wife Chris with him. He's now 72. And David Tamihere is a man of few words, really, but he's always been utterly adamant that the system has never given him a fair break and that all he wanted was another day in court. He'd take that, and now he's got that.
Has he, though? Because there seems to be questions over whether he will have another day in court.
Well, that's right. So what the Supreme Court did was that, hey, look, we're going to order a retrial, but it's up to the Crown to decide whether this is feasible and whether they want to go ahead with that. The prosecutor there, who is Alicia McClintock, now she has the decision to make whether to proceed with a retrial. And there's a lot of things that have to be considered here. We're talking about David Tamihere, who's now 72, who's served his time. He's done his prison sentence. We're talking about a case that's now 37 years old, with evidence that's been lost or that wasn't investigated at the time, given that the scenario about the killings has now changed. We're talking about witnesses who have died. We're talking about witnesses whose memories have now become maybe faulty. And we're talking about trying to recreate a 37-year-old murder in a forensic way that will be reliable for a jury to consider. In the same breath, we've got to remember that this is a very serious crime, 2 murders. And there is a family in Sweden, 2 families in Sweden, who really deserve and need some finality and answers about what happened to their children and their loved ones and whether the right person was ever convicted or not.
Have you spoken to the families in Sweden or to anybody who's been involved in covering the case?
Look, the families in Sweden have been very reluctant to speak and have asked for privacy. I have spoken to people in Sweden, though, and that's part of a piece that I've got in the Post on Saturday, which is a fascinating read, really. We think this is a New Zealand case, but this is still a very important case in Sweden, which a lot of people remember, and the country over there is still fascinated with. So the eyes of Sweden are sort of on what's happening here in New Zealand with David Tamihere's case.
Did this decision get quite some coverage this week?
Yeah, front page news in Sweden, yeah.
Does this really show up incompetence in the police, the prosecution?
I don't know whether it's necessarily incompetence. You can point to perhaps mistakes that were made during an investigation. The delays in these controversial cases, I think, are put down to fundamentally the fact that the system just doesn't like to admit that it's got it wrong. And we've had several of examples of this in recent years. You've had Alan Hall, who was convicted of murder in 1986. It wasn't until 2022 that Alan Hall's convictions are quashed. He was wrongfully convicted of murdering Arthur Easton and spent, nearly 20 years in prison. How did that conviction get overturned? Well, it was the work of a journalist, Mike Wesley-Smith, and investigators like Tim McKinnell and lawyers like Nick Chisnell. And then you've got, more recently, the Gone Fishing case with Gail Maney and Stephen Stone, their convictions for murder being overturned. But again, that's taken, over 20 years. Stephen Stone did 27 years in prison before his convictions were quashed. And here we've got David Tamihere. We don't know whether he's innocent or guilty, but his convictions have been quashed after 36 years. And what does that say? It just says that it's a system that doesn't like to contemplate that it's made a mistake, and it's left to other people, not the authorities, not the police, not the Crown, to push for the right questions to be asked and for another day in court for these people, leading to wrongful convictions being exposed. And I just think this week's decision is another example of how slowly and painfully the system works when it sometimes might have got it wrong.
That's it for today, thanks to Mike White. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Today's podcast was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Ben Pearce. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.